Buffalo Bill Cody was born on February 26, 1846, in LeClaire, Iowa. William Frederick Cody became one of the most famous men in the world through his Wild West show, which toured for decades across the United States and Europe, bringing audiences an epic and romantic version of life on the American frontier. This image captures the spirit of the Lincoln County War in New Mexico around 1878. Drunk and armed men ready to kill over loyalties and contracts. The conflict pitted competing cattle and business factions against each other, with Billy the Kid fighting for the regulators in one of the West's most violent episodes. A family seated outside their home in the mining town of Castle Gate, Utah, between the 1890s and 1910s. Castle Gate was built around the coal mines and represented the simpler, working-class face of the Wild West, far from the violence of popular films made up of ordinary families and long working days. George W. Parsons in Tombstone, Arizona, after returning from Mexico. A licensed attorney turned banker, Parsons was one of Tombstone's most respectable citizens and kept a detailed diary of daily life in the town, providing an invaluable historical document about the period surrounding the OK Corral gunfight. View of the mine on the hillside in Cripple Creek, Colorado, around 1893. Cripple Creek became one of the world's largest gold mining districts after its discovery in 1890. At its peak, it produced over 18 tons of gold per year and housed more than 50,000 people, making it one of the last great gold rushes in American history. Interior of the Table Bluff Hotel and Saloon in Table Bluff, Humboldt County, California, in 1889. The establishment exemplifies the dual role of hotels and saloons on the American frontier, simultaneously serving as lodging for travelers and as social centers for local communities in these young and growing frontier towns. James P. Beckwourth, the legendary mountain man and explorer, photographed around 1860. Son of a slaveholder and an enslaved woman, Beckwourth became one of the most celebrated explorers and trappers of the West, was adopted by the Crow tribe, and rose to be a war chief. He discovered the Beckwourth Pass through the Sierra Nevada, the bar of the famous Gem Theater in Deadwood, South Dakota, around 1880. Owner Al Swearingen, seen in the third position from the right, was both a businessman and a brothel keeper, making him one of the most powerful and controversial figures in Deadwood. The Gem Theater is depicted in the acclaimed HBO television series, View of Dodge City, Kansas, in 1878. At that time, Dodge City was the leading cattle market in the United States, where enormous herds from Texas converged along the Chisholm Trail. It was also one of the most violent towns of the Wild West, controlled by lawmen such as Wyatt Earp and Bat Masterson. Studio portrait of 4 Apache pioneers, photographed in 1888. The Apache people resisted American expansion with more persistence than virtually any other indigenous group in the Southwest. Divided into several bands, including Geronimo's Chiricahua and the Mescalero, they maintained their resistance for decades across the region. Carpenter and amateur photographer John Dunn takes coffee outside his cabin and laundry wagon in Missoula, Montana, around 1900. This intimate image captures the everyday life of a West American worker who, in his spare time, documented the world around him with his camera, leaving a precious visual historical record. Dick Brewer was a lawman and cattle foreman in Lincoln County, New Mexico, who founded the Regulators, a posse that included Billy the Kid. Brewer led operations against the Murphy-Dolan faction during the Lincoln County War and was killed in April 1878, in an ambush that also claimed 2 other men's lives. Geronimo and his warriors in the Sierra Madre of Mexico in 1886, before his surrender to General Crook in March. This photograph was taken during the Apache leader's final period of flight, when a small group resisted the American army using mobility and terrain knowledge. Geronimo surrendered for the last time in September 1886. The widely circulated Illustrated Police News of April 15, 1882, depicted the assassination of Jesse James by Bob Ford, solidifying public opinion about the cowardly act of shooting the outlaw in the back. James had become a popular hero of sorts, and his death at the hands of a treacherous friend shocked the American public. The Crystal Palace Saloon in Tombstone, Arizona Territory, around 1885. Tombstone was one of the richest and most bustling towns in the West during the silver mining boom. The Crystal Palace was one of the most elegant establishments in town, frequented by figures such as the Earp brothers and the deadly Doc Holliday. One of the few known photographs of Josephine Sarah Marcus and Wyatt Earp together, taken at their Happy Days mine claim. Josephine, also known as Sadie, was of Jewish heritage and became Earp's companion until his death. She spent years trying to control the narrative of Wyatt Earp's life and growing legend. Annie Oakley, at age 62, giving a shooting demonstration in 1922. Despite her advanced age, the legendary markswoman still dazzled audiences with her remarkable precision. Oakley had become world-famous through Buffalo Bill's Wild West show and was widely considered the greatest sharpshooter the world had ever witnessed. Theodore Roosevelt and John Muir at Glacier Point in Yosemite Valley, California, in 1903. This iconic photograph marks the meeting of two of the greatest defenders of American wilderness. Influenced by Muir, Roosevelt would create dozens of national monuments and reserves, earning his legacy as the father of American conservation. View of the Deadwood mining camp in the Dakota Territory around 1876, as it likely appeared when Wild Bill Hickok arrived. The town had sprung up just months earlier, built illegally on Lakota lands, and was already a chaotic jumble of tents, shacks, and men mad with gold fever in search of fortune. The Whiskey, the Road to Ruin bar in Gila Bend, Arizona, in 1880. The provocative name reflected the moralistic discourse of the era about alcohol consumption, but did not deter workers, travelers, and adventurers crossing the arid Arizona Territory from stopping in for a drink during their long desert journeys. The final photograph of Buffalo Bill Cody. William Frederick Cody, one of the world's most famous men at the turn of the 19th century, spent his final years in financial difficulty after the bankruptcy of his Wild West show. He died on January 10, 1917, at his sister's home in Denver, still a legend to the world. Bass Reeves, photographed around 1910. A formerly enslaved man who escaped during the Civil War, Reeves became the first black federal officer west of the Mississippi. As deputy marshal in Indian Territory, he arrested more than 3,000 criminals during his career and was never wounded in combat. He inspired the Lone Ranger. The sod homestead of James McCrea, south of the Middle Loop River near Berwyn, Nebraska, around 1888. Sod houses, built from blocks of prairie grass and earth, were the practical solution for settlers on the treeless Great Plains. These unique structures witnessed the remarkable spirit of adaptation of early American pioneers. A deer hunt near Deadwood in the winter of 1887 and 1888. Two miners, McMillan and Hubbard, display their kill. Hunting was an essential activity to supplement food supplies in isolated mining towns, especially during the long and brutal winters of the Black Hills region of what would become South Dakota. The Jackson Bar in Idaho in the 1890s. Idaho's saloons served a diverse population of miners, loggers, and ranchers who were settling the region during the territorial expansion era. These establishments were frequently the first businesses to appear in any new frontier locality, serving as anchors for fledgling communities. An armed posse in Yuma, Arizona in 1895. Posses were civilian groups quickly organized to pursue criminals when formal law enforcement was insufficient or non-existent. On the American frontier, the line between official justice and vigilantism was frequently blurred, and extra-legal enforcement was accepted as a necessary reality. Two Navajo gaze upon the ruins of the White House in Canyon de Chelly, Arizona, in 1913. The ruins belong to ancestral Puebloan peoples who inhabited the region centuries before the Navajo arrived. Canyon de Chelly remains sacred to the Diné people, who returned to it after the traumatic forced exile at Bosque Redondo in 1868. Thathlo Harjo was born in 1791 and lived an extraordinary life. He fought in two Seminole Wars, was removed to Indian Territory in 1842, and still enlisted in the 1st Regiment in 1861 at approximately 70 years of age. This photograph captures a veteran of multiple conflicts who witnessed decades of American transformation. A cattle rustling scene in New Mexico around 1870. Cattle theft was one of the most common and severely punished crimes in the Wild West. In some regions, rustling was considered as serious as murder, and many horse or cattle thieves were lynched without trial by local communities acting outside any formal legal system. The outlaw John Shaw was removed from his coffin and propped against a stake fence for one last shot of whiskey with friends before burial. This macabre photograph, taken shortly after his death, reflects the brutal customs and irreverent attitude toward death that characterized life in the Wild West of the 19th century. Seth Kinman, the famous mountain man, photographed in 1865. Kinman was known for his eccentricities. He presented President Lincoln with a chair made of elk antlers and had a reputation as an extraordinary storyteller. He lived in the California forests for decades and became a symbol of the frontier man's self-sufficiency. West Point cadet George Armstrong Custer, photographed around 1859, approximately 17 years before his defeat at Little Big Horn, holding a Colt Model 1855 pocket revolver. Custer graduated last in his class at West Point, but rose to become a Civil War general and a deeply controversial figure in American frontier history. A miner and his dog near Silver Plume, Colorado, around 1900. Dogs were constant companions of isolated miners in the mountains, offering companionship, security, and warmth during the harsh winters of the Rockies. Silver Plume was one of Colorado's most prosperous mining towns during the Great Silver Boom of the era. Southern Paiute people posed for a photograph in 1874. The Paiute inhabited the arid regions of Nevada, Utah, and California. As settlers and miners arrived, they were progressively displaced from their lands. This documentary photograph preserves the image of a people facing profound transformations to their entire way of life. A group of men drinks beer with a horse inside a bar in Castledale, Utah, around the early 1900s. This unusual and good-humored image captures a moment of relaxation in the Wild West, where the boundary between human and animal space was often thin, and formality was essentially non-existent on the frontier. Chief Eagle, whose full name in his language was Atoam Elam Watch Skill M Me, led the Salish tribe of the Flathead Reservation in Montana, photographed there in 1906. The Salish had inhabited the region for millennia before Europeans arrived and maintained their cultural identity despite sustained pressure from the American government. The third top post of the R Wild West Pics subreddit for 2025, showing the last photograph of Wyatt Earp, taken on January 11, 1929. The legendary lawman, survivor of the OK Corral, died 2 days later of chronic cystitis in Los Angeles at age 80, the last of the major protagonists of that storied era to pass on. A Wintah Paiute hunter taking aim with a rifle in the southwestern Utah desert around 1873 to 1874. Hunting was a central activity for the subsistence of the Great Basin Paiute people, who depended on animals such as antelope and jackrabbit for food and clothing. This rare image documents their traditional hunting practices. Red Hawk, an Oglala warrior, photographed around 1905 in the Badlands of South Dakota by Edward Curtis, courtesy of the Library of Congress. Red Hawk participated in the Battle of Little Bighorn in 1876 and survived to be photographed decades later, being one of the last living veterans of that historic confrontation. In 1885, Apache leader Geronimo fled the Arizona reservation for the fourth and final time, triggering widespread panic across the territory. This escape led to the largest pursuit effort in the history of the American Army, with 5,000 soldiers chasing a group of just 38 Apache men, women, and children. Landscape east of Salem, Oregon, in the 1890s, photographed before it was completely logged by the Great Timber Barrens. The lumber industry devastated millennia-old forests across the Pacific Northwest during this period, transforming vast landscapes of dense forest into agricultural land and open fields for settlement. Chief Joseph, the legendary Nez Perce leader, photographed around 1880. Hinma Tu Ya Lat Kekt heroically resisted the forced removal of his people from their ancestral lands in the Wallowa Valley, Oregon. He led the epic flight of 1877, and upon his surrender, delivered one of the most eloquent speeches in American history. Wyatt Earp photographed around 1887, several years after the famous OK Corral gunfight. During this period, Earp had left Tombstone following his vendetta campaign over his brother Morgan's murder and was living relatively out of the spotlight, working mines and various jobs across different parts of the American West. An undated photograph of Oglala Lakota, Chief Iron Tail with Diamond Black, his bison. The relationship of Plains peoples with the bison was profound and spiritual. Bison provided food, shelter, tools, and clothing. The near extermination of the herds was a deliberate strategy to weaken and subjugate the native nations. View of Tombstone, Arizona, around 1881, photographed by C.S. Fly. Tombstone was at the time one of the fastest-growing cities in the West, driven by silver mining prosperity. Photographer Camillus Sidney Fly holds historical importance for having documented some of the most famous scenes of the OK Corral era. Photograph of Butch Cassidy taken at the Wyoming Territorial Prison in Laramie in 1894. Robert Leroy Parker, Cassidy's real name, served 18 months for horse theft. Upon release, he promised not to steal in Wyoming again, a promise he kept. He later formed the Wild Bunch Gang with the Sundance Kid. Mickey Free, the Apache scout, photographed at the front of his group around the 1880s. Free was a singular figure. Kidnapped in childhood by Pinal Apache, he grew up in Apache culture and became a scout for the American Army. His capture in 1861 was the incident that triggered the Apache Bascom crisis with Cochise. Bronco Bill and Family, photographed in 1887. Cowboys and frontier men often formed families amid lives of adventure and danger. This domestic image contrasts with the violent picture frequently associated with Wild West men, revealing the ordinary human everyday life behind the legendary characters of the American frontier. Bat Masterson in Dodge City, 1885. Masterson was one of the most skilled and feared lawmen of the Wild West, having also worked as a buffalo hunter and professional gambler. After his frontier career, he became a sports journalist in New York, where he lived until his death in 1921, still larger than life. Black Bart, also known as Charles Bowles, committed his last stagecoach robbery on November 3, 1883. The famous highwayman robbed more than 28 stagecoaches in California between 1875 and 1883, always on foot and never firing his shotgun. He was known for leaving poems at crime scenes as his personal calling card.